Hi, welcome back to my studio. Well, lesson number 2 is going to be interesting. I'm going to work on some clear water. Now you may think, wow, what's so interesting about clear water? Well, wait till you see. Clear water contains some of the most interesting intricacies of playing with light and shadow. But of course, we'll get into that later. This little painting will be on a warm morning, lots of clear water, but a nice bright wave moving in. Let me show you again, like I did on the last tape, how I start. Let's go to the little sketch. This little guy was done out of doors as well as the other one. And here I've captured the feeling of some stormy clouds in the background, sunlight coming in from the morning, part of the wave in sunlight, part in shadow, some rocks, but look at all this clear water. Not only the translucent area of the sketch, but the whole foreground is of clear water, and of course somewhat in the background. Then it's all balanced off with this. This is my center of interest right in here on this side. Try to stay out of the middle of the painting. Sometimes I get a little close. But right in here should be the center of interest, and everything lead to it. And that's the other thing. We're going to talk about center of interest also in this particular lesson. For this particular segment, I'm going to use ultramarine blue, manganese blue, and viridian. And I may sneak in some other naughty little color, but I'll let you know what it is. But these in combination without white paint is what we use for clear water, or very little white paint. Let's take a look at the real thing. And let's just take a look at how the ocean really looks. You have foam moving along over an area, and then in front of it or somewhere is clear water. It's reflecting the sky. It has little sparkles, little shadows, a little of light green, a little of dark blue, and so on. These are the colors we want to incorporate into our foreground. So right into the ultramarine blue, just pure now, because it's all going to change later. Just take an area and scrub it in. No white paint. I'm using a great big, well, sort of big, filbert number 8. Pure ultramarine blue, and then pure manganese blue, or if you want to use cerulean blue, you may do that. Scrub in here and there, leaving some areas unscrubbed. And then go to the viridian. And that's a nice green. Get some of that going in here. Now, this little color I told you about that is, I'm being a little bit coy about it because it's kind of a no-no to students. The thing is, I very seldom ever suggest that a student use phthalocyanine green, or as the case may be, Windsor green. And the reason is because they tend to overuse it. Well, a little touch of phthalocyanine green is fine. If you use too much of it, it looks like the bottom of a parrot's cage. It's kind of bad. But anyway, here's some of the bad green into white, and it's going to be used very, very little. Now watch closely. I'm just going to streak in here and there. This gives the effect of what's going on under the water, because light is coming back down into here, refracting, fragmenting, breaking up, and coming back in different colors. And the same thing with the manganese blue right into here. In fact, manganese with that little touch of phthalo actually comes closer to the color that we saw in the shot of the ocean. Just scrub it in. We're not painting anything surface right now. Now the ultramarine blue looks a little bit too blue, so let's do something about it. Let's throw a little bit of alizarin crimson into the ultramarine. And what this will do is give it some depth. And again, you don't paint over the whole thing. You see, what we're doing is fragmenting, making a mosaic, as it were, a mosaic of color. Get the feeling of clear water. And as you note, except for the little bit with the knotty green, there's no white paint into this. Now we'll just jump ahead to, or back here to the background, scrub in the same blue, manganese, ultramarine. It's a little bit dark, but it will be lighting, become lighter later. Get the background in. This is our clear water. And while we're at it, let's get the translucent portion of the wave. A good clean brush. In lesson number 1, you learned how to do that translucent wave. Well, now you can watch it again. It started out with ultramarine blue and viridian at the base. Nice and clean, no white. Quite dark. And then as we move up, we move into the blue-green. And in this case, I'm using manganese blue and a little touch of the phthalo green. And I will use a little bit of white in here. Clean up a bit, add a little bit more white in this corner so it's light, and then gradually, you see, gradually it gets darker. And if you need to darken it up a little higher, you just pull some of the ultramarine blue back up. There we go. And of course the roll gets the same treatment. The wave comes up and then rolls over, and we roll that same green color over. Let's make this wave different than the one in tape 1, lesson 1. Let's throw a little bit of this green color right up into here where it will have a foam burst. Okay. Now that's all I'm going to do with the clear water for the moment. The lesson here, and this is extremely important, basically keep all white paint out of the clear water. Otherwise it won't be clear. Too often I see students want to lighten it to make it lighter in areas, so they add white, and before long it gets chalky. Let me show you another little trick. Just take a plain paper towel. You want to lighten an area? You can. Just scrub out a bit. You begin to see the canvas texture underneath. Incidentally, I work on canvas that I've glued down on board a lot, especially for my outdoor paintings. It's a nice hard surface, and yet it has the canvas texture. But again, I can lighten an area if I wish. I can blend with it, so on. Just don't get carried away. Now on to the next segment. You know, I'm embarrassed. I'm always telling my students, don't rush in. Do your preliminary work first, otherwise you're going to make mistakes, and so on. And you know what? I rushed in. I'm so anxious to show you all of this, I rushed in without going through some of my preliminaries. What line, what value, what color? Let's take a look. I get embarrassed. But anyway, here we go. Working off of my little sketch, I've just given you an outline of what I want. I've arranged so this will be my center of interest. I know where my sunlight will come from. I know where my shadow line will be, where my clear water will be, and so on. That's the outline. Then I worked out my values. Overall, a middle value painting. Most of the area covered is middle value. Then next is the dark, and there will be other little darks worked in as well, but it will still read mostly middle, next dark, which will be water as well as rocks, and then least of all will be the white area or the light area. That's important. This gives a nice balance and it'll work. And I always say one value should be dominant, just as one color should be dominant. and with the color, the dominant is a blue-green. You'll see more of this in the painting than you will of any other color. Also, I have a gray or a neutral that comes in second. And finally, a little bit of pure green, and that's the naughty phthalo green that we used, and a little touch of red, because the red complements the blue-green. Always go to the opposite on the color wheel of your dominant color, such as this, and the opposite will bring you the punch color. And that's what you want to use usually in the center of interest. Now that I've cleared myself, and you've gotten the point that I too sometimes get carried away and want to get painting before I have the details worked out, now we can go back and paint. Well, let's see. Using the same brush, but clean, we can go to the sky area now, just because it will be reflecting on everything else. And for that, I'm going to a manganese blue. And if you don't have manganese blue, use cerulean. That's all right. Into white. I'm going to make this particular one fairly light. It's a warm day, but the sky is quite light, and I'll leave the clouds unpainted. I think that's a cloud area. Let me see my sketch. If I don't have my sketch, how can I paint it? Yeah, those are the cloud areas. All right. This is sky. It's a manganese blue, and there's a little of it showing in here. Oh, a little bit of it here. Now this should be getting a little darker because it's further away from the sunlight, as you can see. So a little more manganese blue in here. However, way out at the horizon, it can be very light, even almost greenish. A little of that green left over on the palette. So let's scrub in that very light color. All righty. Clean the brush. Where are my shadows? And what color is my sunlight? Remember, in the last lesson I said the same thing. Whatever your sunlight color is will determine the shadow of your painting. If it's a yellow sunlight, purple shadows. Orange sunlight, blue shadows. Well, it's a warm morning, so let's go for some orange in our sunlight. And for that, I'll just use some cadmium yellow deep, which is almost an orange. Cadmium yellow deep into white. It's a nice, warm sunshine. And if that is going to be my sunlight color, whoops, it's on this side, isn't it? Sunlight's from over here. You see what happens if you don't plan ahead? You put your sunlight on the wrong side and you're really dead. Or in some paintings I've seen, the sunlight's coming from all directions, and how you pull off that trick, I'll never know. Anyway, with our orangey sunlight, the shadow would be more of the blue. So I'm going to the ultramarine blue into white. It's a little dark, so knock it down a bit. Here we go. And just scrub in the shadow side of these clouds. As you can see, I'm not being in the least bit careful at this point. You don't have to be careful when it's underpaint. You only have to be careful when you're detailing. Good. All right, now this distant headland here, I want it to be very distant. And in order to get that atmospheric effect, I'll stay with the color of the sky. In another lesson, I'll teach you about atmosphere and sunlight. But right now, let's stay with just know that I'm using the same sky color, but darker, and not much darker, to get the headland almost faded to nothing. There we go. That's the furthest headland, way, way back. Then scrub in a little more white at the base and work it up, because if there's any light back here, it reflects onto the headland. Now the foreground, or not foreground, but the near headland will have a little color. The closer objects are to you, the more of the real, or they call it local, color that you can see. The further away, the more atmosphere you look through, so a little less of the local color. So the local color that I have chosen here is ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, and I'll just mix the burnt sienna and blue right into the atmosphere or sky color I already had. And see, it really makes kind of a gray. The reason for that is that burnt sienna is really an orange. So when you mix an orange with a blue, you neutralize them, of course, and you have gray. I'm going to give it a little more of a blue cast way out in here. Therefore, I've added some more ultramarine blue. Further away it gets, and so on. And let it just sort of fade out and throw in another rock. However, as we get down to the base in here, that's where I'm going to throw in more of the actual local color. The local color being more burnt sienna and maybe a little touch of the sunlight yellow. Make it rather light. Let's look at what it would look like on a close-up rock. Wow. There's your punch of orange against blue everywhere, isn't it? But now back there, I've got to mix that with my atmosphere. Make some mud, I can see, but it's all right. As we get closer and closer to our position, the more of that color that we will see. Burnt sienna into our blue gives us this nice subtle gray, warm gray. All right. Now this rock should be stronger yet. Burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, and less and less. Okay. Now this rock and this one are really dark. So ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, but mostly blue this time. Maybe a little touch of alizarin to make it purplish. And let's go for a real dark area here, real dark rock. This scrub. This is underpaint, remember, and we'll pick up on that in a little bit. Refine it a little bit more later. Here's burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, a little touch of alizarin. Here's this other foreground rock, and its little lump. Okay. It begins to speak a little bit. Clean my brush. I'm still using my number 8 bristle. Clean the brush. And go back to the sunlight white. You know, you could actually, if you wanted to, make up a pile of sunlight. That is, whatever yellow or orange you use for your sunlight, into white. Make a pile of sunlight and make a pile of atmosphere. Atmosphere being the color of your sky. And if you do that, you're ready to roll on just about anything you want. Now I'm just going to scratch this in real fast, like this, and down in here, where the sunlight strikes. And if it blends with other things a little bit at this point, that's okay. This is very, very rough. This is only the structure. And up with these foam patterns as well. Where'd that red come from? Don't be caught with dirty brush. You could make a commercial about that. Don't get caught with dirty brush. Oh, Ejon just did. Okay. and that's going to fade a little bit more later. Now our clouds get the same sunlight treatment. In other words, just about anything that's white gets that sunlight treatment. The yellow-orange into white, just scrubbed in, and then later we'll play with shadow and refinements. Pretty soon it will work. Okay, let's see. Do we want a little wave back in here, or no, we do not. We're going to have sunlight streaking in back in here. All right, that mess, and that's what I want it to be at this point, that mess is our structure. And from that, we can build into a painting. But for the time being, what we really want is only the basic underpaint color, because you can't lay a detail on top of nothing. So here is the something with which we can build. Well, we are ready to start refining. We've got our basic structure. So I'm going to start right up in the sky and back to this pile of sunlight, which is cadmium yellow deep into white. Go right back up into the sky, and where the sunlight would be striking the clouds, that's where we scrub in the color. Just like that. And a little bit over in here. See, we don't want too much contrast going on. A little over in here, a little here, maybe a wisp here. Enough is enough. Then, with my brush clean, just blend out some of the edges so we don't have anything sharp back in here. Don't want too much detail or anything that's going to distract from the main subject. I could add a little more ultramarine blue, give a little more depth back in here, just to give more shape, show that there's something back there behind this cloud. There we go. And underneath a cloud, it should have a little more darkness as well. These are cumulus and these are stratus clouds. Just like if you understand what you're painting with the sea, you really ought to understand something about your clouds as well. I always try to. I'm certainly no weather expert by any means, but I do know something about the marine layer clouds that are in my paintings. Okay, we can get carried away with that too. All right, now with the cheap varnish brush, or if you have a hazing brush, clean and dry, I'm going to go back and soften the edges a bit. Just knock down edges that I don't want. And also, where the clouds are over this headland, just haze that out a bit so that it's hard to tell where the headland ends and the clouds began. In the next lesson, I'll be teaching you a little bit about rain and how to use this brush for that. But for the time being, let's just say that that's atmosphere. Like some storm clouds are building up. After all, where'd these waves come from except from storm waves, storms out at sea? Okay, just knocking this down a bit. And I don't think I need to do too much more to the background at this point. Maybe I can clean that down, haze it down a little bit more. I just don't like that straight line. You see, you always need to be judgmental, at least to a certain degree. There, that line fades completely into the clouds. Judgmental only when it's necessary. I've seen students that are so picky with themselves that they just get frustrated and throw their paints away and so on. And I've seen other students who feel like, hey, I did it. It's got to be good. Well, that's somewhere in between. Well, it's mine and Rembrandt move over, and down at the other end, good heavens, I couldn't paint my way out of a brown paper bag. Somewhere in between is where we should be. Let's be reasonable. Let's not really kick ourselves too hard, but let's not give ourselves a halo just yet either. Okay, so always be a little judgmental yourself. Keep picking a bit. Say, all right, let's leave it for now. A lot of times things resolve themselves just by painting something in front of them. I saw a student one time that was trying to paint a sky before she did anything else, and of course you know better than that. And she kept picking at it and picking at it and picking at it. Finally I said, would you put the headland in front before you finish your sky? She did, and she never touched the sky again, because what happened? The moment the headland is in there, the sky becomes background. Now if you worked hard on the headland, the moment you put a wave in front of that, or a rock or whatever, it becomes background, and so on. You have to give yourself time. Try not to finalize any one area until you've gone all over your painting. Okay, let's move on now to the wave. First of all, we're in a quandary right now. What will be the center of interest? Will it be here, or will it be here? And or will it be right in the middle? Well, I've got something to show you about centers of interest. If you will divide your canvas into thirds, just tick it in thirds like this and draw some lines across. Anywhere where the lines cross each other is a good area for a center of interest. This quadrant, or this, or this, or this. What this does is help you avoid the center of the canvas, which divides things equally, or putting it way out on an outer edge. Well, in this particular painting, I have a choice to put it here, which is getting a little close to center, or to put it over here. And this is a nice spot for it. So I'm debating. Also, there's some other things about centers of interest too, and I can use this knowledge to make sure that one area comes out better than the other. Now let me show you here. You can gather a center of interest by attention to detail. Now, I have more information on this rock than on this one. So the attention to detail and the fact that it is in closer shows you want to look at this one before you look at this. Another way to gather a center of interest is to put a different subject in. Here's a seascape, clouds, headland, wave, etc. But here's a little sailboat sitting on the beach. Obviously, you're going to look at that. And obviously, it's too centered. It should have been over or whatever. But anyway, that's another form of getting center of interest. Another center of interest, and this is the one I use the most, is contrast. I want the lightest light in my canvas or composition against the darkest dark in my composition. And where they touch, you see, that will gather more interest than anywhere else. That doesn't mean that you can't have a dark up here or a light down here. But notice the dark up here is not against the lightest light, and the light down here is not against the darkest dark. This gathers your information. And finally, another way to get a center of interest, if you have an overall blue painting, a shock of orange, or an overall orange painting, a shock of blue. And you know, whatever the opposite on the color wheel, if your painting is an overall green, a shock of red, and so on. I'm sure you know what they are. So that gives you an idea about playing with centers of interest that may help in the future. All of those ideas, and you can probably find some other ways as well, will help you decide and help your paintings to read better. Well, let's go into this center of interest over here. That means we've got to play this down and not have such strong contrast here. This has to be our contrasting point. So with a clean brush and our sunlight white, I want to make sure I get a good strong splash of foam going right in here. And then we're going to allow it to fade out by shadowing it. And we're using bluish shadows because the sunlight is orangey. And let that fade out. And watch the shape on these things. I don't want it to be such a perfect circle. It has to change. Okay. One of the things I can do is add more sunlight, give a different shape. This, and I can also come back to some of my bright color, a little tick of the green into white, and let it work its way up, because it starts out as water, the color of water, and then aerates into white, which is either in sunlight or shadow. Okay, now we're beginning to build a major wave here, much different than the wave in lesson number 1. All right. Now, obviously, with this light here and with this dark here, let's punch it up. Alizarin crimson and ultramarine blue, a nice, rich purple. With sharp, sharp edges. I can't help but say, oh boy, that is center of interest. That commands your attention before anything else does because of that. This still has to be played down. All right, let's see, what else here? Go back to our manganese blue and viridian. Pull in a little more roll here, a little dark roll. Knock this down so it isn't quite as translucent as it was. Now we'll throw some shadow into this part of the wave. So there goes the contrast now. No more contrast, therefore no more interest. Getting a little muddied there, a little dirty. What happened was I picked up some rock color. You see, the teacher always has an excuse, but no, students don't. I got a little muddied here because of the rock. The rock did it. That's nice, a little shadow cast from that rock. Okay. Let's take the contrast out of this also. Knock it down somewhat into shadow. And just, again, here's another strong contrasting area. Now, we don't want to always isolate. That's isolated. We need a little contrast somewhere else, but not so strong as to distract from that. So we'll just keep playing with this until it's knocked back a ways. And we're not going to touch into the clear water just yet. All right. See how that's beginning to take shape in there? Now that's still a bullseye. You have to do something about that. Well, let's knock it down to a lighter blue-green for one thing, more like up in here. That takes away a lot of the contrast. And we'll add a few more little foam holes in there. Then we can have more of the darkness down below. Ultramarine blue and viridian, remember. Okay, that's beginning to work quite well. Now I'll do some little detail work in here yet, but let's move on to other things. I'm still working with, this is the number 4. These rocks are small enough that they will be wet from the previous waves. And when they're wet, they're going to reflect the sky. So back to whatever the sky would be up overhead, probably a darker blue, a little bit of white, will reflect off the tops of them especially. Start back up in here. Reflecting the sky gives them the feeling that they're quite wet. Now you don't want to paint the whole thing the sky color, only the tops. So you have to decide, okay, there's a top, there's another little top right in here, there's a top, so on. Whatever would face the sky. And maybe this will a bit, if the rock comes down and out a bit, then it becomes more sky reflective at the base. Okay. I'm not putting in the sunlight just yet. That will be the final little touch on the rocks. And because I want this to be the center of interest, I will add some detail in here later. Again, I'm still not into the final nitty-gritty detail, just refining at this point the basic areas, the structures, and the subjects, the shapes, and whether it's a wave or a rock or foam or whatever. A little tick here and a little tick there. Now, as I mentioned in the first lesson, the sunlight striking an object will bounce back. And in this case, it'll bounce back onto this rock, and therefore that rock should be lighter. It should take some of this color. I'm just going to use ultramarine blue into white at this point, and let it reflect just like we did with the sky. Now this isn't sky color, it's almost the same. It's almost the same color, but what I'm saying is it's a reflection of other things going on around it rather than of the sky. You see what happens? It also gives shape. You can follow a contour along the rock and so on. Now it still needs detailing, but that's basically what I want. Okay, where do we move next? All right, the foreground. That foreground, as you recall, is nearly pure color, hardly any white at all except in that little bit of phthalo green. What I'm going to do is use this varnish brush and knock it down, because right now it has thick and thin paint in it. So I'm going to knock it down without changing it very much, just blurring it, as you might say. Because when you look at pure water, clean, clear water like this, it is blurred because it is moving underneath. There you go. So I'm not using a lot of pressure here. I'm just a light, whiskey brush stroke just to knock down the tooth being the thick edges of the paint. I'll keep that brush clean, clean, clean. Okay, now that we have that, this is a little number 2 brush. You see, natural little things happen, little darks against light and little lights against dark and so on. And we can enhance that. Let's go back to our phthalo green with a touch of manganese, that real purity green. and just nick it a few other places. And I follow a line here, you see, little chips and little chops. There's a contour going on, which helps with the movement. It's all underground, or underwater, I should say, underwater movement. All right, now the crowning thing for that will be what goes on top. But before I do that, I feel this ultramarine blue in here is just simply too blue. So I'm going to knock it down with some red, ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson. I'm going to make some little purple swaths in here, little purple dit dots. Get rid of some of that blue. It reads better already to me. Actually, you should step back from your paintings. You know, I tell students, walk a mile for every painting. That means you walk out that way, take a look at it because it looks differently. In my own studio, I have a mirror right over here. You can't see it at the moment, but the mirror helps me. I walk over to the mirror every so often, and what I see is this in reverse. And that's when I see, uh-oh. Or my wife comes in and she says, oh, you have a cloud and it looks like Mickey Mouse. Well, I don't throw paint or that sort of thing. I don't, I always say, gee, thank you. I'm sure glad you told me. And I fix it. But it's true, when you're painting, you don't notice things that others notice. You have to give it time. Okay, now that we have that clear water improved, I'll knock it down a touch as well. Knock down the latest. Now we can come back with the little brush, number 2, with some foam pattern, linear pattern. Now look, this is mass pattern in here. Massive blankets of foam. Let's put it in a little bit more first for you. It's thick usually, a few inches thick. Sometimes it gets quite thick with heavy storm swells. In our next lesson, we'll work with a storm surf. Okay, thick foam here, but then over here will be linear patterns, the same foam, only lines of it. Now, what's the direction we have here? Notice this line that I've created with the little lights among the darks? Well, if we have a line going like that, we don't want our foam patterns doing the same. We want our foam patterns to cross it. I'll show you what I mean. Thick and thin. Always keep your brush clean and lay it down. If you dig in with the point, you're going to lose it. It's going to mix with what's underneath and won't look good. So thick and thin, the edge of your brush. Look real close over my shoulder here. You see how that's working? I'm crossing the underwater pattern going this way. I'm going this way with my pattern. Now we get into shadow at this point. So I go to the shadow color, which is the white foam in shadow, which is blue-white. The same thing. You see the line, underwater line going this way, I will come across the other way. Under the rock, some thick, some thin. They join in a few places. Look real closely here now. You see they have to join. They have to leave a rounded hole behind. Thick, thin, lost and found, dit dots. a few with holes behind. You don't want a lot of it. It gets too doggone busy. And busyness is as bad as dirty brush. And you don't want either one. You don't want busyness, you don't want dirty brush. All right. Now, while we're reflecting sky, let's go back up in here and reflect some sky as well. Ultramarine blue, a little bit of manganese back in there. Notice I use the edge of my brush again. That's how I'm able to paint wet into wet, you see. I don't have to wait for an area to dry because when I paint, I don't dig into the underpaint. That's because I have a light touch, laying the brush along, plenty of paint on my brush. The underpaint has been knocked down. I drag it along lightly. I'm going to leave behind what I want without blending. And that is the secret of working wet into wet. Got a mess right here, haven't I? Well, we'll clean it up. Let's see, a little sunlight. A little sunlight color on the foam pattern. If those foam patterns are just too tough for you, two things. One, practice on something besides your painting, like on scrap canvas or paper, whatever. And the other thing is just leave them out. A lot of painters don't use them. And you don't have to. I use them because of their interest. I enjoy them. But I will admit it did take me a long time to learn how to do these foam patterns. And I'm still learning, actually. Okay, remember also the top of the roll, the top of the wave, right in here, needs some sunlight. Now, right here it'd be in shadow, but back here, the sun will go past, and I just drag that light right on over. There we go. Now, with that sunlight coming from that direction, I have to ask myself, would there be sunlight here? Or would that rock cast a shadow? And I think you know the answer. I think you know. But the sunlight can strike this rock, comes right through that crevice and right there. And that's our next step. Let's go to our sunlight color. Cadmium yellow deep, maybe a little burnt sienna from the rock, a little bit of sky color. Let's see if this is too yellow or too orange. Let's find out. Remember, our basic color is a blue-green, so we kind of want a little red in it. Yeah, red matches the green, orange matches the blue. We have an orangey sunlight. This is the dark side of it. Kind of a rusty orange. Sunlight white into the color. Yeah, that's working. A little nick of it here. Now, I don't want to put too much here because it's going to start distracting from this. This is my center of interest right here. Just a little bit here and there. Okay. In fact, let's go behind this rock and lighten, make that in full sunlight back in here. All right. Now I think it's time to get out the little tiny brush. Well, I'm back to nicking it here and there to detail it out. I'm using a little tiny watercolor brush, a little 0 or 00, and again using the edge of it just to get a little nick of reflection or whatever ever so often. This is the final little stage. Make sure that the roll has some sparkle on it, little dots, and lots of little chip chops. You noticed in the cut-in of the ocean that there were a lot of little chip chops. These are little tiny swells among the big swells, and they reflect the sky and they reflect the sunlight. There we go. I'm using the pure sunlight color here, pile of sunlight. I think my contrast is still over in here, which is fine. It's not here any longer. You know, you can do translucent waves until the cows come home, and it looks just like everybody else's. So sometimes you don't do them, you just leave them kind of weak, especially with morning light. It takes light coming from behind to make that really translucent. And if you have light coming from behind, it's an entirely different mood. So right now, I think I'm very happy leaving it like this. We'll do translucent waves in other lessons. A little more sunlight here, a little wispiness. Kind of a lace curtain effect sometimes. The water folds and folds into its spray, and the sunlight picks up on those edges. Little sunlight hitting here. I'm back to more of a pure sunlight than I had before. A little more of the sunlight yellow. Just picking up a little nick here and a little tick here, and adding detail again. Now, if I wanted some cracks and textures, I'd go back to this purple alizarin ultramarine. Just a little bit. We don't need a lot. Put some little holes in it here and there. That's enough. That's plenty. Now I notice also this rock just sort of sits on top of the water, and that's the worst thing you can do. You want that rock to look like it's down in the water. So watch what I do. Number one, I'm going to pull some of the surf water right up into it. Like this. And let some of it trickle down. Now, in the next lesson, I'll talk about rocks and trickles and spills like this. So I won't go into the detail of it now, but just see that that's what I'm doing, is letting some water trickle off, pulling the surface right up, washing it, you might say. Let the water wash up into the rock. And then, of course, in the clear water, let's go back to the rock color. Burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, a little of this, a little of that. Yeah, here we go. And reflect it. And again, just little chips and chops. Broken, fragmented. This whole foreground is a fragmentation of color and sunlight and shadow. And so now we're fragmenting some reflected light as well. Not too much. That kind of carries it rather well. Well, I think it's time to quit again until I lay it down for a day or two and then come back to it. And I may fuss with it a little bit more. But the main thing is, I think you've learned the color has to carry sunlight. Sunlight has to carry color both ways. So when you choose a color for your sunlight, it's going to influence everything. And that we have a warm morning effect because we used a warmer sunlight than we would ordinarily. And of course, the clear water, how to fragment that light, get the feeling that you can look down into it and it's moving down in there. Who knows, maybe that's a fish right there. Yes, it is. There's a fish there, and there's another one over there, I'm sure. Anyway, some seaweed and whatever down in here, but you have the feeling you can look down into depth as well as looking out into a scene. And we faded the scene back in here so where it's not as interesting to look at as our center of interest. And of course, remember, on the center of interest, there's several ways to pull it off, and all you need to think about is how and what you want. So in the meantime, I think that'll wrap it up for the lesson number 2. I think we stuck pretty close to the original theme, maybe improved on some of it. So in the meantime, you do it too by paint, paint,